Hi everyone, I'm going to do my level best to stay level and not blur the picture. For those of you who've been bearing with me through all these audiovisual nightmares, I thank you so much. I believe next week I'll be able to resolve them. If you can put up with this just a little longer, I would be, anyway, I thank you very much. And if you haven't been able to, well, I understand. This is a PS to the last video I posted called Two NFPs in a Crashing Plane. And that was an armchair typing kind of video I made, in which I made reference to a kind of home movie made by the comic Ricky Gervais, who I believe would identify with the ENFP type. And it was a trip that he took in a private plane with Louis C.K, who I believe is an INFP, or that's what he would identify with. And I made reference to things in the video, mainly with reference to Louis C.K, that I think really exemplify INFP. Really what I was speaking about is the issue of the two topmost functions in INFP. That would be dominant introverted feeling and auxiliary extroverted intuition. There were a couple of instances in that in those videos that I cited that I will paste into the description box of this video now below. I missed a couple of really good opportunities to show, to just point out some terrific examples of heavy FI use in action in Louis C.K. So this is just the first of a few more videos I'm going to be making about him. I don't know, maybe one or two, I'm not sure. But I've just watched so much of his stuff over the years, and so I definitely have some exemplars of exhibit of the workings of his most important cognitive functions, the most influential ones, I believe, that he has. Now here's the thing, just in case someone didn't see the other video and they're about to dive in, I just want to tell you that this video is Gervais and Louis C.K. It really has some foul language and some extremely dark humor. So if you don't like those things, just be aware before you jump in. Now to talk about them, here was there was an example in the second video that's below in the description box now. It was the one that in the other video I said was the one that really cinched it for me, that Louis C.K. I think would identify with INFP over ENFP, which is the type that with which INFP shares all the same functions, but ordered slightly differently in like a crisscross formation. And in that video, it's one of Louis C.K. being interviewed with a fellow comedian and co-star of the movie. It's an animated film, The Secret Life of Pets. And in that video clip, Louis C.K. is getting interviewed with Kevin Hart, who's really boisterous and funny and is quite a good foil for Louis C.K., who looks very awkward in this thing for the most part, which I found to be very funny. More awkward than I've ever seen him, and I've seen a lot of his stuff, a lot of interviews with him, and a lot of, yeah, just all kinds of stuff. Both of his three of his TV series I've seen at least part of, and on and on. I've never seen him look this awkward as he did in this interview, which was for somebody else's big project. It wasn't completely run by him, or majorly creatively directed by him. And I think that's significant, his awkwardness there. Anyway, I talk about that in the other video. But here is an example of something that he did in that video with Kevin Hart, that interview, that I thought was really typical, again, heavy FI. I don't know how many times I've seen such stuff with my many INFP loved ones. This very dark humor that can come out of them. I'm not saying everybody, but maybe it's, the ones I know, but I know a lot of them, and yeah, the ones that are really close to me, they have a real propensity for, well, going to the dark side. I really think that having that cognitive function, introverted feeling, and prominence in one's cognitive function stack really lends itself to being able to, in fact, being unable to turn away completely from seeing the darker sides of life in terms of people's suffering or injustices in the world, or things that FI would naturally be very preoccupied with. It being a function that is preoccupied, other than with being associated with a very deep, rich emotionality, which is more or less ongoing and is more or less causing the person with its influence and prominence to be very aware of their feelings, their emotions, and for them to be aware of their strong emotions to be going on pretty much continually. I now understand, especially since thanks to a recent podcast by Michael Pierce, which was yet another mind-blowing document for me, which really talked about how very, very different is the subjective experience of living with heavy FE influence versus heavy FI influence. I already knew that we were living, the heavy FI people were, in this sense, living in a different world from the heavy FE people. After hearing that lecture, it's so much more, the gap is much vaster than I had previously imagined. More about that later. Anyway, so yeah, people with heavy FI, they're not afraid of heavy things, heavy subjects, what a lot of other people would consider too depressing to bring up or to think about very long, to tend to, people who would like to, subjects that a lot of people would like to sweep under the carpet and forget about if they possibly can. People with heavy FI quite naturally think about those things, and I think when that heavy FI influence is paired with the so-called intuitive, intangible information gathering function high up in the cognitive function stack, I think what you get then is a kind of big picture view on things that are very, very emotional, and that have to do with an FI person's value system, which is going to be, the higher up the FI influences in the cognitive function stack of the given type of a given person, the more constantly vigilant and attending they will be to this value system, which is comparatively very complex and very deeply felt, and is constantly influencing the person's perspective and, of course, their decision making. It's a judging function. So in the case of the INFP, it's the dominant function. So that is really, people with who are INFP, they really can't get away from a very kind of facing the world first, as it were, with an attitude of subjective evaluation. And I say evaluation, so I don't mean necessarily, it goes way beyond good, bad. It's very highly self-referential, very, very subjective, and an FI person's value system. And all kinds of things are always being weighed against that internally developed system. And again, I'll go into this some more in other places, and other people have too. But Jung himself really saw a lot of parallels between the kind of operations of TI, introverted thinking, and of FI, introverted feeling. And I'm seeing more and more and more connections there myself, and I'll be talking about those more in subsequent videos. Anyway, where was I? Back to the interview with Kevin Hart and Louis C.K. Louis C.K. did something in there, other than look really awkward and uncomfortable. He did something very, I think is, it would not be hard to find an INFP who could relate to this behavior. Let's put it that way. Kevin Hart is joking around and talking about how he has a shoe, meaning he has a deal with Nike to have his name put upon a certain model of shoe. And he's talking about that and joking about that, showing the shoe on camera. And Louis C.K. comes up with, how does it feel, something along the lines of, how does it feel to have your name all over child labor, how does it feel to be involved in that? And that's the kind of thing that I think most people of other types this is not a welcome subject to entertain most of the time, and it's the kind of thing you want to get away from. But it's the kind of thing that INFPs, and ENFPs too, to a good extent, are thinking about all the time. And I think that's a really good thing to understand about heavy FI people, is that for us, part of the reason why we can bring up these dreadful topics and we can discuss them openly, and we kind of expect that to be fair game conversationally, is because when you have heavy FI, you are naturally drawn to seeing discrepancies between the idealism inherent in your value system and injustices in the world and suffering in the world. You are going to be very aware of that, whether you like it or not. And so that's a really good example of Louis C.K. making fun of that, like bringing that right out. That's it's a pretty awful thing, and a very painful subject. But he just brings it right up after not saying very much about anything else in the interview, and makes it funny. But that's a really prime example of the kind of things that INFPs very often think about. Many INFPs, not all INFPs, but another example of heavy FI. Well, first let me say a couple other things about FI. When FI is in prominence, what FI the function really concerns itself with, other than this rich emotionality and the it's about, you could say, moral philosophy. It's about evaluation on the level of according to one's value system. So yes, so morality definitely enters into it in the colloquially understood sense. Also, what distinguishes FI operations from, like the nature of them, from say FE, which is an entirely different thing, is FI, just like TI, has its eye on the long view. It does not serve the interests of the present moment. That's what FE does. That's what FE is built for, and that's the really important function that FE, broadly speaking, serves in society, is that it attends to creating and promoting and fostering and protecting harmony in the present moment, in present company. FI, on the other hand, like TI, is looking for enduring moral truths. That's a very important aspect of what it is and what it's after and what it is preoccupied with and what it is in search of. And so, people who have heavy FI are very often asking themselves questions that have to do with, again, evaluation of things, but not evaluation in the sense of logic, which is a big, big preoccupation of TI. It asks questions like, what is the best way to live? That kind of a question is very, very compelling to someone with heavy FI, like an INFP, or an ENFP, or an ISFP, or an ESFP. But probably the INFP and the ENFP are spending, again, these are big generalizations, but the people with the intuitive information gathering preference are probably, on the whole, more of those people are spending time on concentrating and ruminating and wondering and hypothesizing about abstract notions. So you'll notice, and I'm going to go into this with many more examples coming up soon, that in Louis C.K., pretty much everything he talks about on air, so I've seen him do this in I don't know how many interviews. What he says in interviews is very often very, very similar to what material he does in his stand-up comedy. And what you can notice about his comedy, the thrust of his comedy, is that it's very interested in the most colloquial kind of everyman sense. It's all about moral philosophy, really, if you look at it. And that's where you see this massive FI-driven kind of range of preoccupations. Most of what Louis C.K. has to sort of make jokes about is he makes observations using extroverted intuition, which has this sort of scanning quality that looks for patterns in the objective world. looks for meaningful patterns in the objective world, particularly those having to do when it's married to a feeling function right next to it, high up in a cognitive function stack. It is looking for patterns in the external world that have to do particularly with humanist values and with people and those kinds of concerns. And when you look at Louis C.K.'s comedy, there's a reason why pretty much all of his comedy in his middle age, like his later years, I would say like his best work. I'm not very into here we go, right? Here's some heavy FI for you right there. It just slipped out. I was just like very self-referential again. I don't care for Louis C.K.'s early comedy very much, but I really like what he's been doing the last 10 years. You know, I know that. And most of that comedy has huge... it draws on his autobiography. There's a whole lot it's all about relationships. It's almost entirely about relationships, or it's about sort of man in the street observations of what's going on out there in terms of behavior. And then what it's about is about him observing with the NE, the auxiliary NE, I believe, and INFP. He's observing these phenomena, and then he's rendering a judgment about them. A value judgment about them, which is what INFPs, that's their MO, is rendering value judgments about pretty much everything they encounter. It's the lead thing that they do cognitively. And so, for example, that's where all Louis C.K. stuff comes up about, you know, a generation of spoiled brats or whatever. Like, his stuff is social commentary, and it's very funny, and it's very rooted in kind of anecdotes that have to do, usually having to do with individuals, rather than super high concept stuff. But his comedy is very preoccupied, as FI is generally when it's strong, with what is the best way to live. What is the definition of a good life? What is the right thing to do? What's a good thing to do? What's a worthy thing? These are the preoccupations mainly of FI, other than the day-to-day, like, do I like this? How do I feel about this or that or this or that? But the bigger questions, the philosophical questions, are those kinds of things. And there's an excellent example in the airplane video with Ricky Gervais, where Louis C.K. is mentioning something about, it's Ricky Gervais who brings it up, who says, do you know about those people who have, two parents who have more than one child, who travel separately when they're doing air travel, so that out of a fear that, or not a fear, but they're making provision for the possibility that if there's an accident, at least one parent and one child will still be alive, and. And again, like, this is the kind of stuff that NFP people talk about for fun, okay? So, yeah, this is the kind of thing we think about. We think about these things, inevitably we do. And then we talk about it with each other, and because it's so painful to think about such things, then we need to release the tension, so we use our imaginations to generate absurd scenarios around those things, and to kind of extend them in this direction and that with NE to get a laugh, to sort of increase the tension to the point we laugh about something, or because it becomes so absurd, Anyhow, Ricky Gervais puts this to Louis C.K., and Louis C.K. is just and Louis C.K. immediately, this is what INFPs do all the time, immediately just goes, oh yeah, those people. And he just sort of, like, kind of subtly, but not really, you can totally get the message right away that he's like, oh yeah, I know about those people who do that, who think that that's a good idea. And you can tell that he's rendered a judgment about that, and he's very confident about it. And he's just like, no time for that, And Ricky Gervais said, being very ENFP typical right there. He's like, well, why? Asking the question. He's game to find out why. He's like, well, don't you think that's a sensible idea? And Louis C.K. takes all of 3/4 of a second to wrinkle his brow, and then he goes, no. And he has, it's so funny, because that is introverted feeling right there. That's it. he has a value judgment to make about moral philosophy that he has considered carefully, probably, and he is completely confident in it. Now, I happen to agree with him. That's probably part of why I like Louis C.K.'s comedy so much, is I completely identify with where he's coming from, but obviously, hundreds of millions of people do, so whatever, and they're certainly not all NFPs. But the way that he did that, where he just said with this total confidence of like, no, that, meaning by that, like, is that any way to live? In his estimation, no, it's not. That's a stupid thing. That's a stupid way to live. Or it's not worthy for some reason. He doesn't get into why. And I thought to myself, in identifying with it, I went, isn't that funny? Because I know that as someone myself with the type ENFP, with FI in the auxiliary, that I too have all kinds of very strong opinions about what is a good way, what's a good way to go about doing things, what's a worthy way, what is answers to the question I put to myself in different situations, what makes a good life according to me, according to my values, according to what I value, makes a life worth living. And when I saw, and the thing is, when you, again, if you're heavy FI and you look at that, it's funny. It's funny. Like it's said of FI, just like TI, that the FI moral system, the evaluation apparatus, is developed at somewhat of a remove from the outside world. It is somewhat impervious to the concerns and edicts and all the objective data out there in the external world. It's a system that is developed internally and kind of everything is interlocking, everything has to be coherent, everything needs to be aligned in order for the person with heavy FI, or the person with heavy TI, in that case, with logical systems, to be able to rest about it. We need to kind of reckon it out very heavily. And we've put a lot of time and energy into this, and nobody puts as much time or energy into this as an INFP who's developed their dominant function of introverted feeling. And when you have that heavy FI, you just have these, not you just have, you've worked it out, but you also have this sort of strong sense of this is worthy, this is not, according to me. And I feel very confident about that. And furthermore, I don't care if other people disagree with me. This is what I think. And this is how I evaluate it. And it's quite funny when, if you're a heavy FI person like I am, when my attention is drawn by rationality to go, is that the only way to look at things? Is that really, is there anything, quote, wrong with people who choose to live their lives in such a way that the parents divvy themselves up and divvy up the kids when they take plane trips? Is there something wrong with that? I mean, rationally, I have to say no, not on the logical level, no. But I do know that for myself, with heavy FI, I totally understood Louis C.K. in that moment, just going like, no, no. And people who have heavy FI have lots and lots and lots of opinions like that, that they've really thought about. And voila, it's a terrific example of heavy FI in action. So I'll be doing more about Louis C.K. and his alleged INFP-ness. And thank you for joining me for this one. Goodbye.